Understanding is that the recent theme here in chapel services has been, does God have a plan for my life? And I want to focus on that theme again today with you, but maybe take just a little bit different direction, maybe a different perspective, because God does have a plan for your life. The psalmist said before your DNA was ever formed, God had formulated the plan for your life. And so that's a given. God has a plan for your life. And I know sometimes it's difficult to find out maybe what that plan is for your life. But let me share something with you in introductory statements that I think will be a help to all of us in discovering what God's will is. And that is, if my life is at this moment in the center of God's will, as best as I know it, that predisposes me to be in a condition that whenever God's ready, and He will let you know, He can communicate that. But if I'm not where God wants me to be, God's will be a vague, nebulous concept for me many times. And throughout our life, once God does reveal His plan to us, unfortunately, at least for me, God has never given me the exact details, or He's never given me all the chapters in the book that's being written. He never has, and I'm guessing for you as well. So there are times when we find ourselves at a crossroads, and God's plan is we understand what God's plan is, but now we've got this situation, this circumstance, and we're at a crossroads, and we have a choice to make. And the choices we make at the crossroads of life are going to determine whether I and you fulfill God's plan and purpose for my life. As I thought about that, my mind was instantly drawn, really almost instantly drawn to Genesis chapter 39. I actually shared this material some years ago. Probably some of you were maybe still in junior high school, probably, maybe maybe elementary school, but so you weren't here, so you don't remember it. But the life of Joseph is an incredible life, because Joseph had dreams. Joseph discovered early, he didn't know all the details, but he knew that God had a plan for his life. And yet, he found himself many times in the narrative at crossroads. But Joseph made choices, and I just want to, kind of a narrative-style sermon, picking up here in Genesis 39 and working our way as far as we can, or wherever we feel like maybe the Lord wants us to stop at before lunch. I'm pretty sure the Lord would want us to stop before lunch, aren't you? I just feel it. Not in my heart, but I feel it. Genesis chapter 39, verse 1. And what has happened here is Joseph, in the earlier context, has gone out to search for his brothers and make sure they're okay. They capture him, throw him in a pit, later sell him to a trade caravan that's traveling toward Egypt. And Joseph, this man, the young man who believes that God has a plan for his life, is now stumbling along, tethered to a slave chain, wandering through the blinding sun of Egypt's deserts, and his destination is not a pinnacle of greatness now. It's the public humility of perhaps a slave auction. Genesis 39 verse 1 said, Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought Joseph of the hands of the Ishmaelites. Joseph, unable to escape the leash of slavery, is now dragged to Egypt, and he becomes the personal property of a man named Potiphar. And as Joseph settles into the life of an Egyptian slave, the question that he must answer is, were my original dreams, was all of this that I used to think of, that God had this great plan for my life, was all of that just ambition? Was that youthful ideologies? What was that? See, when God's plan for our life is challenged by life taking a detour that we don't anticipate, it calls into question, did I really know God's plan? Was this really God's idea? I think the phrase of verse 2, the first phrase of verse 2, expresses a fact that readily Joseph may not have instantly recognized. The phrase declares, do you see it? The Lord was with Joseph. How many of you know that that's a realization often better seen in hindsight rather than real time?
That's true. That's true.
At times, the drama of life causes us to miss the hand of God that is writing the script. And I think such must have been the case for Joseph. I want us to talk about some of the particulars of God's presence in Joseph's life, but please consider this important life principle. The final chapter of any man or woman's life, while made possible through God's amazing grace, is only realized because of the personal decisions that are made, both in the triumphs and in the trials of life. Choices. See, the measure of a life is not the result of the opportunities or the obstacles that have been encountered along the way. Rather, it is the result of an individual's choice as to how these opportunities or obstacles are faced. I saw a post this morning from Kim Dotson Walker, who is a fellow classmate of mine. It was good. She said, no, your hurt may not have been your fault, but your healing is your responsibility. Think about that. See, leaders or people who realize God's plan for their life, truly successful people, are those who under God do the best they can with what life has brought to them. And as this story reveals, life doesn't always dance to the music we're playing, does it? You see, when adversity comes, the temptation is to cancel the ambition, the quest for excellence, just to resign myself to the fact that it was never really meant to be anyway. And in that moment, it's easy to allow the zest for life to give way to cynicism, settling for an average and mediocre life. The temptation that accompanies difficulty. It was easy for Joseph to look forward to a life when he was just a boy. Mostly his life was ahead of him. It was easy when he wore the coat of many colors. But now the security of that coat has been stripped away. Now he wears a slave's garb. It's easy to think grandiose thoughts when you're home having visions of bending sheaves and falling stars. But now his dreams of greatness have given way to the fate of slavery in a distant land. So what do you do when dreams turn to dust? When the choice son becomes the cheap slave? When your destination for greatness, all of us want to get there, is delayed by a detour? What do? You're at the crossroads. God has a plan for your life. He still does. God is not surprised by this. It's choices that we make. And it was in this moment that Joseph surrendered his life to God in a way that he had never done heretofore. It was in this moment that Joseph resolved that if I cannot be great as a master, then I will be great as a servant. Choices. And God won't make that choice for us. We have to make that choice. See, greatness is not the result of having your tie straight on the day of the big interview. Greatness is born out of a commitment to excellence among the mundane and the undesirable assignments of life. And Joseph resigns himself. Well, maybe that's not the word. How about Joseph squares his shoulders and he sets his jaw and he deepens his confidence in God and declares that if a life of slavery is to be his place in life, then he will be the best slave that the Egyptian empire has ever known. And if he had not, this story would not be a part of the biblical narrative. He would have died a nameless slave in Egypt. But when he stood at the crossroads, he made a choice. And because of that choice, we're not surprised to read verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. This becomes obvious when we read on and discover verse 3. Joseph's master, Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with Joseph. And again in verse 3, and the Lord made all that Joseph did to prosper. And Joseph found grace in Potiphar's sight, and look at this, he served Potiphar. As I read these few verses, I read the words of verse 4. Joseph served Potiphar. That caught my attention, so I dug a little deeper. The Hebrew word is found only twice. The Hebrew word for serve there is found only twice in the entire book of Genesis, and both times it's in reference to Joseph's life. Here in verse 3, it's a reference to the way that Joseph meets his assigned duties in Potiphar's house. Joseph found grace in Potiphar's sight, and he served Shawrath Potiphar. The next time this Hebrew word is used is in the book of Exodus. Exodus 24, verse 13, where it is used in reference to Joshua. And the verse reads, and Moses rose up, and his minister, or Shawrath, Joshua. Do you see that? Joshua was to Moses what Joseph was to Pharaoh. Now, Joshua is like being the vice president, right? It's like he may already know that he's going to be the handpicked, chosen successor to the great leader Moses. So you can kind of understand the motivation for serving, right? In that capacity. Joshua labored to make life easier for Moses. He was his Shawrath, his minister. But Joseph found grace in Potiphar's sight, and he was his minister. And what I'm after here is, when the assignment is one that serves my interest, when the responsibility is such that if I do well, my efforts will be applauded, my position promoted, the natural tendency is to give it my best. But everybody knows, everybody knows that serving and menial work for a common slave is not rewarded, it's expected. And if a slave approaches his work carelessly, then he risks being beaten. But if he applies himself and he excels, the result is, well, maybe he's not beaten. But advancement and promotion, that's seldom the goal of the common slave. Death is the only change in career on the Facebook status for a slave. Joseph is aware of this. And yet, his 90-day job evaluation reads as follows. Joseph Shawrath, his master, Potiphar. See, greatness is not the result of having the tie straight on the day of the big interview. Greatness is born out of a commitment to excellence and choosing rightly among the mundane and the undesirable assignments of life. And make no mistake about it, my friends, your plan, as is the case in God's plan for my life, God's plan for your life, it will have some mundane, monotonous times. Well, the result is verse 4. It's the unheard of among most slaves. Promotion and advancement. And Potiphar made Joseph the overseer of his house. And all that Potiphar had, he put into Joseph's hand. Love that. While you're noticing verse 4, let's read the narrative of verses 5 and 6. And it came to pass from that time that Potiphar had made Joseph overseer in his house, and over all that Potiphar had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And Potiphar left all that he had in Joseph's hand. He knew not aught that he had save the bread which he did eat. So Joseph is promoted, and the result is further prosperity for Potiphar. Now, that last verse would have never been written had it not been for the choices that Joseph made. Character is what causes us to make right choices. Character. You know when character is formed? Character is forged in ordinary life. It's a Monday through Friday exercise. Character is forged in ordinary life, and then it's showcased in extraordinary moments, and always in that order. Joseph is where he is because of the choices he's made. I like this next verse. This might be a verse that the ladies need to hear today. Verse 6, Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. It's a rather bland way for the Old English King James Version to tell us that Joseph was well-built and handsome. He was a 10. He was a real head-turner. I mean, when Joseph came into the room, the ladies noticed. To elaborate, I share the following only for the humor of the account. But one of the chapters of the Quran is devoted entirely to Joseph. This may be the first time the Quran's ever been referenced at the pulpit here, but it represents Joseph as being this perfect beauty, as the most accomplished of all mortals. And it also gives Potiphar's wife's name as being Zuleika. From the account, it seems that the adulterous attempt of Zuleika was known to the ladies of the Egyptian court, and the ladies of society had formed a bad opinion of Zuleika. So in an attempt to excuse herself, Mrs. Potiphar, or Zuleika, invited 40 ladies from Egyptians' who's who to dine with her. So when the ladies arrive, this is all according to this reference to the Quran's interpretation of a story here. When these ladies arrived to dine with her, she put knives in their hands and she gave them oranges to cut. And then she ordered Joseph to come into the room. And when the ladies saw Joseph, the account reads, they were so struck with admiration that instead of cutting the oranges, they cut their hands to pieces, crying out, "Oh God, this is not a human being. This is none other than a glorious angel." Now, all of you handsome guys should probably start calling out and warning the kitchen staff before you make your entrances. Adam Clark, a little more in our league, has some idea that actually this Mrs. Potiphar was a very chaste woman, but Joseph was so incredibly handsome that he alludes to this poem. I understand from the daily increasing beauty which Joseph possessed how love tore away the veil of chastity from Zuleika. I tell you all of that to say Joseph was. And then the King James has the audacity to translate verse 6, Joseph was a goodly person and well-favored. But here's what happens. And I'm going to end with this. I could go a lot of places further in Joseph's story, but Joseph is admired by Mrs. Potiphar. And he's got a position of prominence now. I mean, he is known at the Nile Savings and Loan. The Egyptian stock markets recognize him. This guy trades and he's successful. He's brought Potiphar some substantial wealth. Put yourself in Joseph's situation. His lifelong dreams have been dashed when he's thrown into a pit, then sold at a slave auction. He becomes a servant. And finally, after some time, he gets to a place where he's recognized, and He's promoted. He stops wearing slave's garb. He's a successful businessman for Potiphar. Can I tell you that just as disappointment can cause us to abort God's plan for our life, so can advancement. And while disappointment and discouragement maybe sharpens our spiritual senses to turn to God maybe for a moment, advancement and promotion can dull our senses to where we kind of give up on God's plan and we think, you know what, this is a pretty good life right here. You're going to face that temptation.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's good.
Joseph faced the temptation at a crossroads of temptation, sexual temptation. And he stood strong. Joseph faced the temptation of being lied upon, and he resisted bitterness and cynicism and anger. But when he became a prisoner on trumped-up charges, what did he do? He made the same choice he made when he became a servant. Joseph said, you know what? I had dreams of greatness when I was a boy. I didn't ever dream that I would be a prisoner in a foreign land with no possible hope of parole. But if this is what it is to be, I will be the best prisoner that Egypt has ever known. And he made a choice. As a result, he became the prison trustee, the warden, second only to the warden. He had a long detour in his life. And I just wanted to come today to tell you that your life, as my life, is going to take detours. Even though it's God's plan, it will not march down the parade route that you've marked out for it. It just doesn't. And where a lot of us miss God's plan is at the crossroads of disappointment, of opportunity, of temptation, of broken relationships and suggestions to bitterness and anger. But Joseph, in all of this, made right choices. While a student here, you're in the dreaming years. This is preparation. But when the course requirements have been met and the tassel is turned and your dorm room is emptied, I was going to say cleaned. That'd be a first, wouldn't it? You will begin to live out what you have dreamed and planned for. For some of you, that will take you to a classroom. For others, you will go to the mission field. Some will move to a parsonage. Still others will begin a career that may not be a Christian service, but at least it will be what you feel that God has planned for you. And at the risk of sounding like a pessimist today, I have just prepared you for real life. Life has crossroads. And whether you realize the plan for God is going to determine whether you make the right choices at those crossroads. And today, I'm asking you right now to make the right choice. But remember Joseph, and at the crossroads of your life, make the choice to let God's plan be fulfilled in your life. God bless you. Thank you for your time.